that at least 90% of all adults in this country will be eligible to be vaccinated by April the 19th, just 3 weeks from now.
With both vaccinations and infections on the rise, US President Joe Biden faces a growing list of other domestic issues. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. When President Biden took office back in January, the top domestic priority was the COVID-19 pandemic. And while that remains true today, the administration is in the midst of dealing with other domestic crises while trying to advance the president's policy agenda. It's a delicate balance made more difficult by a deeply divided Congress. For more, we turn now to CGTN's White House correspondent, Nathan Kingston. Nathan, there are a number of key domestic issues on the president's plate, among them voting rights, unaccompanied minors, and of course, surging migration at the border with Mexico. And later this week, the president will be unveiling his infrastructure proposal. So break it down for us. What does it look like from where you are?
Yeah, from where I am, I think President Biden has learned from when he was vice president. He wants to go big and he wants to go quick. And there are several reasons for that. He learned under the Obama administration that essentially trying to work with Republican colleagues did not work. However, you're right, there are multiple balls to juggle here. First of all, let's take COVID. They think after the American Relief Act, they are pretty much on a good turn, although we'll get to the details in a minute. When it comes to the migrant problem at the border, essentially you heard from the president last week, essentially in his first press conference saying, look, we inherited essentially a dismantled system. It's a seasonal surge before the hot weather means people can't come across the desert. I am not necessarily just a nice guy allowing people in, but we are going to be more humane. Although we are seeing tremendous trauma, of course, at the border of filled facilities, and they say they are fixing that. This is the biggest pushback he is facing so far from Republicans, because they know with their own base that immigration is a hot button issue, and of course previous President Donald Trump won a lot of votes with his vow to build the wall, although it's not keeping necessarily people out. Now let's go on to infrastructure. Infrastructure was a thing that actually US President Trump wanted to do. We had a joke here at the White House during his term that every week was infrastructure week. It just never got done. They want to go big. $3 trillion is the whisper number here. They're going to pay for it with tax hikes, we understand, although not wholly. Now, the question is whether they can get it through in a deeply divided Congress, as you said. Some of this will be very popular with Republican House members who want bridges and roads and airports built, and let's face it, spending is always popular at home so long as you can pay for it. The Senate is another question, although Joe Manchin, the centrist Democrat, has hinted he would like it if they could pick up a couple of Republican votes, to be sure. But if not, as you know, if it's just purely financial, well, it's difficult to see how they would pass it through reconciliation because of the rules. You're only allowed one a year, but you never know. They might squeak it through. Again, the filibuster debate about whether you need 60 votes to go through is key here. I think essentially they want to achieve as much as possible in 100 days. They know they have a slim majority in the House. They have essentially a majority in the Senate. If they can squeeze it through with Kamala Harris, the vice president, as the casting vote, and they know that the first 100 days essentially defines the presidency, and they are learning from Barack Obama. And they want to get as many wins as possible before the midterm elections in 2022. As you know, America is in a perpetual election cycle.
Right, and of course, Nathan, the pandemic remains a high priority. Over 93 million people here in the United States have now gotten one or more doses of the vaccine, and over, let's see, 51 million have now been vaccinated. But there's also a new warning from the CDC, and Dr. Deborah Birx, you remember her? She used to be on those briefings with President Trump. She was one of President Trump's pandemic advisors. She spoke to CNN and made a rather startling admission. What can you tell us?
Yeah, let's deal with Dr. Deborah Birx first, because I'm really pleased you raised that. You'll remember her from being the sort of essential coordinator for the COVID-19 task force under Mike Pence, the former vice president. You also remember her on the side of the briefing room when US President Trump suggested shining lights on you or maybe some sort of bleaching to cure COVID-19. Her face told it all, but she didn't really complain in public about it. Well, she went public on CNN and essentially said quite dramatically that while the first 100,000 deaths were terrible, they were probably unavoidable considering how unprepared the US was for the pandemic, etc. But the other 400,000 plus deaths could have been mitigated. I mean, that's a lot to say, and also pointing out the politics was rife in terms of decision making, and that the vaccine rollout was a disaster, going essentially against the Republican talking point that essentially Operation Warp Speed under President Trump sort of set up the success that the Biden administration have with the vaccine rollout. Quite incredible. Of course, she's not a member of the current COVID task force, although Anthony Fauci is. Now on to present day. You know, it's amazing. It's the other side of the coin. While the Trump administration was saying, look, it's going to go away, don't worry about it, and having their internal battles with COVID-19, there's a death toll ticked up. The Biden administration completely the other way, and there has to be some questions about whether it's too much the other way. Let's listen to the CDC director, because this is quite incredible.
I'm going to pause here. I'm going to lose the script, and I'm going to reflect on the recurring feeling I have of impending doom. We have so much to look forward to, so much promise and potential of where we are, and so much reason for hope. But right now, I'm scared. I'm speaking today not necessarily as your CDC director, and not only as your CDC director, but as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter, to ask you to just please hold on a little while longer. I so badly want to be done. I know you all so badly want to be done. We are just almost there, but not quite yet.
Impending doom. I mean, that's quite incredible considering vaccinations in this country are sometimes 3 million a day. About the rolling average over the last 7 days is 2.7 million. But she has a point. Cases are up, sometimes 40% in states that we wouldn't expect. Connecticut, for example. We've seen all the pictures in Miami of spring break and stuff. It's Connecticut, it's Michigan, it's Pennsylvania, which are worrying people. And the big question here is it 2 steps forward with the vaccine and 1 step back in terms of infections? But as you know, there are less hospitalizations, less deaths because of also the treatment when it comes to COVID-19. And I'm not just talking about the vaccines. So the question is, you know, are you overly cautious as you see light at the end of the tunnel, as the Biden administration seemed to be doing so, just to get people in line, continue to social distancing because they want to get out of this for real very quickly? Or will it turn off the public who are literally fed up with this, obviously, despite the death toll and the suffering that we've seen economically and socially as well? So it's a real balancing act. I'm just interested to see how the public react to that sort of impending doom question. I'm sure the panel has more to say about it.
Yes, I'm sure they do. And thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting from the White House. Well, as Nathan said, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Adolfo Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist. Chris Hahn hosts the Aggressive Progressive podcast and the syndicated Chris Hahn radio program. Also with us, Rafael Bernal covers politics for The Hill newspaper, and Joseph Williams is the senior news editor at US News and World Report. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. And Joseph Williams, let me start with you, and let me start with something that is making a lot of news in the country, generating a lot of controversy, and that is voting rights. The state of Georgia in the United States has passed laws that Democrats say target mainly African-American voters, black voters, people of color, making it harder for them to vote. There's also been a pretty sharp response to this law from President Biden. He has called it outrageous, and he also said that it goes back to a period in the country when there was a lot more discrimination against people of color. Democrats in the state of Georgia have gone to court, a federal court, to try and stop implementation of these laws. But what do you make of it? And I mean, what do you look at what the Republicans in that state are trying to do?
It's easy to see what they're trying to do. I mean, very clearly, after they lost the election and lost the Senate in Georgia by a relative handful of votes, Biden took Georgia for the very first time. Stacey Abrams was widely credited with getting people to the polls and getting that win in the bag for President Biden and sending 2 Democratic senators from Georgia, first time that's happened in decades. It's very easy to see that they're staying from that defeat, and so Republicans have decided to turn the dial to 11 as far as voting rights are concerned. Now, certainly back in 2019, they passed a series of laws, 2018, 2019, to make it more difficult to vote. You had voter ID laws that were tightened. You had voter locations that were cut. And yet they still lost. So that has very much been a stinging point for Republicans there, that they want to make sure that they solve a problem that doesn't exist, and that problem is voter fraud. There was very little evidence of fraud in the election, yet they're saying these measure of bills will make it more secure. Certainly they did throw a bone to the left, who want an expansion of voting rights by allowing early voting to expand very slightly. But in doing that, they gave with the right hand and took away with the left, making it more difficult to vote by mail, making it more difficult to vote in a vote collection station, 2 measures that the Republican legislatures approved in order to get more people to vote. And in doing so, it seems like they're also working against their own interest, because not only did, even though Democrats did win the state and had a record turnout, Republicans did too. So they expanded the franchise. They competed on what could have been a level playing field, and they still lost. But it seems like they want to make sure that things are locked up and in the bag, and that the votes are won, that the election is won, rather, before the first votes are even cast.
Adolfo Franco, as far as Democrats are concerned, this is something that's not only happening in the state of Georgia. They point to the fact that in 43 states in the country, Republicans have tabled something like 250 laws that would limit mail-in voting, early in-person voting, and even election day voting. And as I said earlier on, President Biden had a very sharp response to what was going on. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
What I'm worried about is how un-American this whole initiative is. It's sick. It's sick. Deciding in some states that you cannot bring water to people standing in line, waiting to vote. Deciding that you're going to end voting at 5 o'clock when working people are just getting off work. Deciding that there will be no absentee ballots under the most rigid circumstances. The Republican voters I know find this despicable. Republican voters.
So, Adolfo, if we go back to the 2020 election, the presidential election, and of course the election for Congress as well, we saw that voting patterns are changing, demographics in the country are changing. What do you make of these complaints, these accusations that Republicans are trying to turn back the clock?
Well, I think this is absolute nonsense in every regard. First of all, I don't know what Republicans Joe Biden is speaking to. This is about voter integrity. This last election was completely mirrored in a divided country, many millions of people believing the election, there was election fraud and irregularities, and that election laws needed to be tightened up to ensure the integrity of the vote. Now, voter ID, to get into this building for this studio, I had to show an ID. To get on an airplane, I have to show an ID. To go to the doctor's office, to drive. There is no problem having IDs. In fact, that is how you assure integrity in every facet of our lives. If you don't have voter ID, you dilute the vote of those that are legitimately going to vote. So this is a canard by the Democrats for a long time, that is suppression of the vote when people just have to show their photo IDs. The law is strengthened. It eliminates the signature requirements for absentee, which is more difficult, and now has an ID. So therefore, you don't have to compare signatures. My gosh, when I write the signature often, they don't look exactly the same. This way, there's an ID. So this is a strengthening of the laws. And I must say, even this water thing, if I can quickly, it's political parties that are precluded from sharing water. NGO or anybody else can give water. These are just red herrings.
Right. As far as these charges in the last election of fraud, you know, politicians can say there was fraud, but if we look at what happened on the ground, I mean, there were a number of investigations, a number of court cases. There was no evidence of fraud.
Well, a lot of court cases were actually dismissed without ever getting to the merits because of the courts that were really not engaged in the practice of trying to decide elections in this country in the first instance.
Right.
Secondly, election laws have actually been relaxed. They were relaxed in Georgia, and it created this type of chaos. There's nothing wrong with absentee voting. There's nothing wrong with mail-in voting if we can have verifications that are in place. But at the federal level, they're talking about registering on the same days without an ID. I could vote in 3 jurisdictions in the Washington, D.C. area without showing an ID. Come on. And this is just common sense that requiring people to show who they are to vote is a minimum requirement.
All right, let me go to Chris Hahn. Chris, to Adolfo's point about the integrity of elections, the Georgia governor, Brian Kemp, in fact, he says these laws are an attempt to expand voting and ensure election integrity. We've also heard from the senior Democrat, at least the senior Republican Senator, Lindsey Graham, who responded to President Biden's comments. This is what Lindsey Graham had to say. Let's listen.
You know what's sick is have the President of the United States to play the race card continuously in such a hypocritical way. So every time a Republican does anything, we're a racist. If you're a white conservative, you're a racist. If you're a black Republican, you're either a prop or Uncle Tom. They use the racism card to advance a liberal agenda, and we're tired of it.
Chris, go ahead.
Well, when the shoe fits, wear it. This bill in Georgia is absolutely designed to suppress the vote. And not only are the contraction of voter hours and all the other things we talked about horrible, but there's a provision in there that will allow the Georgia state legislature to basically overturn elections if they don't like the results. That in and of itself is a huge, huge problem here. The problem is Republicans can't compete on the field of ideas anymore because their ideas are unpopular and they don't serve even their own constituency. And when people are asked if they like things that Joe Biden are doing, like the stimulus bill, like his rollout of COVID, he's getting 70% approval in some of these things, sometimes even 80% approval. Republicans have no match for that. They don't have anything that ever approaches that. Their policies don't work. They don't serve people. They are old and they are confusing, and it's time for them to be put to bed. They need to come up with some new ideas rather than trying to stop people from voting. I believe in America, we need to have competing ideas. What we have right now is the former guy's conspiracy theories that all Republicans now must subscribe to, or they are no longer part of that party. And then we have a Democratic Party, which sometimes competes with itself on ideas, which is trying to move this country forward. We can't have both. The Georgia law and laws like it being proposed in Florida and Arizona and other red states are despicable. They are a blatant attempt to try to deny the franchise to people who will not ever vote Republican.
Rafael Bernal, let me get your view on this. As I mentioned earlier on, the Democrats have gone to court, federal court in the state of Georgia, to try to stop implementation of these laws. What do you think is the solution here? A new Voting Rights Act, perhaps?
Well, Joe Biden and the Democrats certainly think that the solution comes from federal legislation. And frankly, it's almost as if the Republicans in these states are making life easier for them, because it's certainly not a good look. Governor Kemp signing this bill. There was a Democratic legislator trying to get into the room. She knocked on the door. She's black, and she got arrested by white Georgia state troopers. In the room were only exclusively white middle-aged men watching Kemp sign the bill. The image was compared to the signing of Jim Crow laws, fairly or unfairly. It's a bad image. Above the governor was a picture of a plantation that in its time held slaves. They are not being careful with their imagery. If they indeed want to promote an idea of doing this for election integrity, and as you said, there's really no evidence that this last election was marred by fraud in any meaningful way, that many people may believe that it was, is really a product of what happened after the election, indeed before. And former President Trump's rhetoric about the election and his supporters, what they said. It's a belief that was engendered not by fact but by rhetoric. So it's making it easier for the Democrats to convince their own centrists that they have to do something drastic in the Senate to pass through legislation to protect the minority voting rights, essentially. So they're kind of falling into President Biden's game, bypassing laws like this and bypassing them in this manner.
Adolfo, I know you want to say something about this. I'll give you 30 seconds for that, and then I want to talk to you about the situation on the southern border.
Yeah, very quickly. The state of Washington, a Democrat state, the Democratic Secretary of State said it took 5 years for that state to perfect secure mail-in voting. Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, they made these changes within weeks in the case of Nevada. Of course, the integrity of the voter system was put into question. I have no idea, and Senator Graham's absolutely right, how race has anything to do with showing your ID.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any ID?
Go ahead, Chris. Finish your thought.
They want driver's license and things that poor people don't generally have.
Okay.
Poor people don't go to the doctor's office and they don't drive.
All right, Adolfo, I'm going to turn to the other big issue, and that is the crisis at the U.S. southern border with Mexico. Thousands of migrants, many of them unaccompanied children, are at the border. This is what the White House press secretary had to say. Let's listen.
We are not going to send children under the age of 18, kids under the age of 18, back on this treacherous journey. They are fleeing challenging economic circumstances, hurricanes, prosecution in some scenarios. It does not mean that they get to stay in the United States. It means their cases are adjudicated. And we want to treat them humanely, make sure they're in a safe place while their cases are adjudicated. That's what we're talking about here.
So, Adolfo, the White House says that it's adopting a more humane policy at the border compared to the policy that was adopted by President Trump, where he actually asked people who are applying for asylum to do it from outside the country. So how is this going to get resolved?
Well, it's a crisis that's been created by this administration. It's a colossal failure because they changed the policy with having nothing in place. Now, this thing that Jen, who I know personally very well, I know Jen, that she simply says that they're going to process these children, but not necessarily return them. That's just not the case. They, as she has said before, they come with telephone numbers, they're being released, they're being flown, in fact, throughout the United States if they have a contact here with another illegal immigrant. This is absolutely a consequence of a policy that was set where people are not going to be returned until they're into Mexico until they're processed. Something we had worked out with the Mexican government, with the triangle countries that had worked efficiently, and this Trump administration had been a success. So this is a colossal humanitarian failure by this administration.
Joseph Williams, you know, we've heard this before, that this was a crisis that Joe Biden created.
Well, in some respects, it's happening on his watch. I mean, he didn't create this problem. President Trump, in fact, did not create the immigration problem. The immigration problem was created back in the 80s by a policy that repatriated young men and young women who had not set foot in their home countries or their parents' country of origin, and that led to these economic crises. What's the problem here is that we've tried a bunch of different approaches. We've tried the abject cruelty, I don't want to say that because that's kind of pejorative, but the stark Spartan treatment of these children, and it's been very difficult to move this battleship. Under President Biden, there are children who are being held in these cages or in these detention centers. There are people who are being flown back across the border without any knowledge of knowing what's happening to them, and they are people having to request asylum from outside of the United States. He's been in office for about 2.5 months. It's going to take far, far longer to fix it.
Okay, Rafael Bernal, what exactly is the status of those at the border right now? You know, as I said earlier on, President Trump said that those who are seeking asylum would have to do so from outside the country. Another thing is that President Trump's administration put into effect something called Title 42, which is a rule which enables the authorities to prevent people from entering the country based on health concerns. President Biden has retained that. He hasn't done away with that.
So that's key because Title 42 actually accounts for the majority of border crossings, the majority of the so-called surge, if you want to use that term. It's basically people, adults and family units who cross the border, either seeking asylum or not seeking asylum, you know, trying to sneak in, who get caught or interact with Border Patrol officers can get kicked out into Mexico immediately if under a CDC order because we're having a pandemic. It just boils down to that. What that creates is recidivism. People don't have a penalty for trying to cross one day and the next and the next. You know, you could have the same person trying to cross and get caught 5 times in a week, and maybe on the 6th time he gets in. So that large, again, surge of single adults who are really the bulk of people trying to cross in during the Biden administration during the last 65 days are mostly recidivists. And what we're realizing is DHS is maybe finally starting to realize that its enforcement policies are not the main unique driver of immigration, that it's a regional phenomenon that's actually been going on since the 1930s in more or less its present form.
Okay, Chris Hahn, you know, if we look at the politics of this, immigration is a very divisive issue in this country. It can really make or break a presidency, and I think it was Nathan King at the beginning of our show who said, look, you can attribute a lot of President Trump's win in 2016 to the immigration issue and the very hard line he took on that. So is this a very treacherous issue for Democrats in the way they navigate it?
Look, in 2013, the United States Senate passed a very comprehensive Border Security and Immigration Modernization Act. It had broad bipartisan support. John Boehner, the Speaker of the House at the time, refused to take it up because he wanted the issue for a midterm election. It is time for the House of Representatives to take that bill up this year with Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic majority, pass that bill and send it back to the Senate. Chuck Schumer will take it up, and I bet you that could get 60 votes and pass in the Senate. It had sponsors from both sides of the aisle. It was a Gang of 8 bill. It would actually solve a lot of these problems. Is there some politics at play here? Yeah, but look, Republicans have tried to play the immigration card every single year for the last 4 years. They tried in 2018 with the whole migrant caravan issue that they tried to push on Americans. They don't buy it. America is a country of immigrants. I am a grandson of an immigrant. I'm sure everybody on this panel has their own immigration story in this country, and Americans generally approve of immigration and would like to see comprehensive immigration reform.
Right. And right. Okay. Jos Williams, very quickly, I've got very little time left. I'm going to talk about the $3 trillion infrastructure plan that President Biden has been talking about. He heads to Pittsburgh later this week to talk about that. He wants to revamp the country's ailing infrastructure. I mean, there's also money for Social Security, for health care, for child credits, tax credits, etc. He says he will raise the money needed for this through tax hikes. Do you see this passing at all?
He says he wants Republican votes for it. Republicans say they are in favor of infrastructure. Infrastructure Week is kind of like Groundhog Day around these parts. You hear about it time and time again, but nothing ever really happens. The notion is very good. We do need upgrades in airports, bridges, roads, and the like. However, the mere fact that Republicans have already stated that if this bill has any more provisions in it that don't have to do with bridges and roads, they are out. And so I have a hard time seeing him finding 10 Republicans to vote for this. It probably will be party line unless they break it up, and even that is going to be a heavy lift.
Okay, Adolfo, I need a one-word answer for this because I've only got 5 seconds. Do you think there will be Republican support for this bill?
A slimmed-down version, but not his plan.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.